Okay, now here we are on part two of Module 8, the decolonization of our taste buds. One of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about is costs of food production. When you look at those contact and pre-contact ways of producing food that still exists in a few of our communities today, when we look at the cost of food production, that is, what all is involved in doing this gathering of food, when we look at those more simpler systems of horticulture and hunting and gathering, we find that there's basically three areas of cost. The first is time, and this is kind of a controversial concept because there have been people in the past who have just assumed that indigenous people spend huge amounts of time just getting enough money to getting enough money. That's a Freudian slip. It's a huge amount of time getting enough food to keep themselves alive. And this is a pretty common, it's particularly common at the turn of the century, back in the days of social Darwinism. Um, but it's not really true. The amount of time spent gathering food and in horticulture is relatively small. And the reason for that is because of the abundance that's found in nature. When people go to gather salmon in the days of before they were so greatly reduced, people would go out and spend a week or a month gathering food that would last for several months. And people go into the sugar bush in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and they would gather maple and make maple syrup and maple sugar. And they might spend a month out there camping and hanging out in the sugar camp, but they're going to end up with food for themselves and food for the extended family that's going to last a year. People gather wild rice over a period of about 3 weeks, and during that time, they'll get enough for their families for the year. So the relative amount of time that's spent is not as great as it seems in terms of the amount of time and food production for horticultural and hunting and gathering um, societies. But it does take time, and it is one of the costs, but it's not quite as great as some of the earlier anthropologists made it seem. Another area of cost of food production for the horticultural and hunting and gathering societies is based in energy expenditure. One of the things that we see is that when you're actually gathering your food or hunting for your food, or you're out working in your field for your food, you're spending a tremendous amount of energy to gather it. And it's not one for one, meaning 1 unit of energy spent to gather 1 unit of energy. But it is pretty high, and that's part of the reason, perhaps, that um, we have such issues relating to diabetes and heart disease and this kinds of thing in our society, because we do not spend very much energy getting our food, and as a result, we end up taking in a lot more food, taking a lot more energy in than we expend because we're not actually trying to get our food. So there's this direct relationship where you're actually working in the field, actually out gathering plants or plant products, or you're actually hunting or fishing, and is that direct expenditure to get food. But there's also an indirect energy expenditure in that a lot of times you have to spend time working on your implements for your horticulture. You may have to build nets and work on repairing nets or make new nets. You may have to work on your arrows or your bows, or you may have to make baskets to hold your food. So there's an indirect energy expenditure as well that's directed for the cost of food production. And then lastly, the other cost is access to land and water. Now, in pre-contact and early contact days, there was no cost. indigenous people had access to the land and to the water. But with the arrival of the concepts of private property, suddenly, in order to have access, you have to have money in order to either lease or buy or rent or have some kind of way of allowing or gaining access to the property, either by buying it or somehow leasing it from the person who has the legal title to the property. And the same is true for water. And so today, quite a lot of people are limited in their desires to perhaps involve themselves in horticulture because they don't have a piece of land, and they may live in an area where land is very expensive. So no, we end up looking at access to land and water today as a cost, although it wasn't something that was the cost in the old days. Now, in comparison, we're going to take a little bit of a look at industrialized agriculture production. And one of the things that we find right off the bat is that industrial agriculture production equals low cost for food. And this is pretty true. You can go down to Walmart and buy food fairly cheaply, food from around the world. You can go to McDonald's on the dollar menu. You can go to Wendy's. You can go to KFC. You can go to all these places where the food is relatively cheap. And a lot of it is because of the industrial production, mass production, huge fields, maybe 20 or 30 miles long, producing one particular kind of corn that's going to be used to feed the cattle or feed the chickens. And then you have a processing plant where the animals are run through the plant and are killed and processed, and they're turned into meat. The same is true for plant products. Huge economies of scale that result in relatively low cost for food. And even when you look at the cost of production, when I look at the cost of production in agriculture, I'm talking about the land, the cost of actually planting and harvesting a crop and getting the crop to the point where it's going to be processed. And that cost falls primarily on the farmer. The farmer sells their product to a processing plant. The processing plant, takes the animal and turns it into meat, takes the plants and turns them into whatever it is they're making: bread, lasagna, canned tomatoes, canned green beans, frozen corn, whatever it is that they're processing. There's a cost involved with that. Huge plants, costs of freezer, if you're going to have frozen corn, frozen spinach, any of these vegetables you see, or even frozen food that's already cooked, like frozen pizza and these meals that you can go to grocery store. You go to the freezer section, and there's these full meals there. Lean cuisine as an example. That's a part of the processing, and there's a cost involved there. There's also the cost of transportation, and so for the example I gave in the last section, where you're eating strawberries in January in Santa Fe, you know that they were flown in, because if they were brought in on a boat, they would have spoiled because it takes so long. So they're flown in. And what's the cost of that transportation? What's the cost not only in terms of, well, we'll talk about that in the next slide, but how much does it actually cost to bring up berries and fruits and vegetables from Chile, shrimp from Ecuador, these kinds of things? It's food coming from all over. I said earlier that the average loaf of bread travels 1,500 miles from the time it's harvested from wheat. It goes through processing, and then it goes someplace and it's baked and it's brought and taken to a store. And the same thing is probably true for potato chips. And then you add in these really long distance hauls for fresh fruit coming from Chile into North America in January. There's a huge cost of that transportation. And then, of course, there's costs of marketing and distribution. We've got to get this food out to, we need to get this food sold. So we have a very major efforts towards marketing food, whether it's ads on TV or billboards or ads in newspapers and magazines. And then we have stores, and the stores, sell a lot of food, but they also have a lot of people working for them. But you can look at all of these costs of production, and we look at the low cost of food, relatively low cost of food, and we realize there's still a profit being made. And so it's kind of an interesting contradiction. We have all these costs that are added into the cost of producing industrialized food, and yet we can go to Walmart and we can go to McDonald's and buy food very, very cheaply. But there's also some hidden costs that we don't know about, that we don't often see. The first hidden cost is the adverse impacts of these industrially processed foods, and we're looking at diabetes and heart disease, particularly high cholesterol and that kind of thing. There's been some studies about autoimmune diseases that are based in diet, a lot of negative impacts from fast foods and certain kinds of additives that impact the ability of the body to take care of itself. This is something that is one of those hidden costs. Um, People, say, diabetes and heart disease, and particularly cholesterol, are decisions that we all make, and those are some of the choices that we have to make. And as we make those choices, we need to realize that these are some of the hidden costs of food production on the industrial level. The other one is a high reliance on genetically modified organisms like GMOs. We don't know what the long-term impact of GMOs are on humans and animals that are used. They feed the chickens and the cattle GMO corn, soybeans, and it boosts um, the rate of fattening. They produce GMO corn that's resistant to herbicide or has within it a gene that creates a pest, and you'll see that in the Vandana Shiva movie video. She's going to be talking about that. So we don't know that impact. We also don't know what the potential is in terms of the unintended release of pollen. So we do know that a lot of these GMO plants are designed to be sterile, um, so that you have to go back to the companies such as Monsanto or Conagra or some of these other companies, and you're forced to buy your seeds every year. You're not allowed. You can't save your seeds because they're sterile. And what happens if these unintended release of pollen gets out, and suddenly you start having large patches of non-GMO corn or wheat or some other plants suddenly becoming sterile because they've been unintentionally impacted by the pollen from a GMO. And then the last thing is the GMO process, and industrial farming relies tremendously on monoculture, meaning you can go for these huge, huge fields with just one plant. Now, I rode a train one time from Albuquerque to Worcester, Massachusetts, and we was going through the Midwest, and you just, it seems like you went for miles of just one kind of corn. Every now and then you'd see a field that might have two kinds of corn in it, or just miles and miles of soybeans. That lack of diversity is a major issue in terms of one of the hidden costs. That we're cutting down on the number of number of plants and things of this sort. And lastly is this high reliance on petroleum and petrochemicals. We use petroleum for the farm machinery. We use petrochemicals for fertilizer and herbicides and pesticides, and those things are necessary to produce the kinds of food at the costs that we like through industrial production. So as we decolonize our taste buds, the real point here is to be aware. We all make decisions about what we're going to eat and why we're going to eat it, but the idea here is to be aware of those things that are not only the true costs, the hidden costs and the costs that we see. And as we become aware of those things and become aware of where we get our food, then we begin to be able to make the choices and make the effort to decolonize our taste buds and return to one of those more appropriate foodstuffs.